2022, Dongshan City. A guy in a black t-shirt with black hair touches his face in surprise and says that this is not a dream, sitting in his bed on the floor and looking at the purple rift in space right in front of him. He said that he woke up and the entrance to the dungeon was right at his house. In 2012, similar portals began to appear all over the world. After a series of riots caused by competition to explore these portals, the dungeon spiraled out of control. Soldiers armed with machine guns fight goblins running at them. The government has introduced 5 rules. 1. You can't get rid of the portal, but a raid can seal it. 2. If you fail to close it within the specified time limit, the defense will fall and the dungeon monsters will flood into this world. 3. People who get lost in the dungeon and still survive are doomed to stay there, becoming adventurers. 3 men, a swordsman, an archer, and a mage stand in a battle stance in the forest, surrounded by wolf-mouthed monsters. 4. The higher the level of monsters in the dungeon, the greater the reward for conquering it. 5. Top-level dungeon bosses can't even be destroyed with a nuclear warhead. 10 years later, because of the continuous appearance of new portals and their endless captures, the world has gradually come to terms with this. In recent years, information about dungeons and adventurers has gradually begun to leak out to the public. In addition, the Canadian edition of Adventurer Weekly published a research report. The newspaper has an article with the headline, Adventurers. Only 1 out of 20,000 won good luck. It says that as of July 2022, there are about 35,000 registered adventurers worldwide, and that on average, there is 1 adventurer for every 20,000 ordinary people. The article says that these 350,000 adventurers have an average net worth of $20 million. The lack of jobs, the hungry rich, and the importance of social status, which is chased by everyone from bandits to officials, have contributed to the fact that the profession of an adventurer in the hearts of people has become a cherished dream. To the public, adventurers are the root of evil, an opportunity that can't be exploited, but it can't be eradicated either. The host of the evening show asks a man in a yellow suit with white hair that his profession has brought him more than $500 million in the last 3 years. He replies that even though he's been dubbed the legendary adventurer, this is just the beginning for him. But few people know that behind this high-level adventurer are hundreds of corpses of mid-level and low-level adventurers, as well as civilians who got lost in the dungeons. The main character's name is Cheng Hai, and he is one of the few people who knows this dirty little secret. Cheng Hai scratches his head thoughtfully, wearing glasses, a black t-shirt, and yellow shorts. Looking at the entrance of the dungeon, he told him that he had caused him trouble. He thought about the fact that 5 years ago, the death rate when entering an entry-level dungeon was 50% and half of the cases were fatal. Thinking about it with a tense face, he concluded that as much as he needed the money, the risk was too great. Cheng Hai is an expert on the secrets of dungeons and adventurers, and the author of best-selling books such as The Immortal Adventurer, Oni, and Death Knocks. He took out his phone and decided that it was better to give it to the government, or rather the Adventurers Guild. He recalled that when an ordinary citizen found the entrance to a dungeon and surrendered it, they were rewarded with rare treasures. An alert from a news channel appeared on the phone screen that an association employee in Shanghai was arrested by the police today, and according to reliable sources, this person is suspected of murder and reselling portal coordinates. Shanghai stared intently at the phone screen and shook his head, saying that he wouldn't necessarily get someone who wanted to kill, thinking about whether these people would rent out the portal later. Then he thought that it would be impossible to sell the portal to some financial organization either, because they would have to use it at least 10 times in the beginning. And in the future, in order to prevent him from selling the items that he would receive as a reward, they would follow him and he would die in an accident before these 10 attempts are over, and concluded that it is not a good idea to test the moral level of capitalists on their own safety record. Then he looked at the portal again and thought that he shouldn't just leave it like that either, because as soon as the time runs out, he will turn, the monsters will break out, and this will inevitably lead to victims and destruction of state facilities, and the main character can be soldered for 20 years for knowing about the existence of the portal and not reported it. Cheng Hai decided that the first step was to check the portal's level, and if his death rate was higher than normal, then he would just move to another city and before leaving, call the police to deal with it themselves. He added that if the survival rate is normal, then he will try to cope with it himself, and if it doesn't work out, then he will use the option above. He opened the treasure hunter picture book on his phone on the dungeon portal level table. Next to the image of the purple portal, it says that this is a hunting entrance to the dungeon, which has a survival rate of 80%, and that the tasks in it are mainly related to hunting monsters in the dungeon. The main character concluded that this was a second level entrance. The level of the portal can be judged by its size, and the entrance to Cheng Hai's house is too small, so the only possible level is the entry level. 2 days later, a yellow uniformed courier called at Cheng Hai's door, announcing that he was a courier. Cheng Hai opened the door a crack and told him to come in. The courier handed him a box with a receipt for receiving the parcel and asked him to sign. While Cheng Hai was signing, the courier quietly asked him that he had discovered a new portal, explaining that otherwise he would not need to buy chain mail, which caused the main character to turn pale in surprise. Taking the bat in his hands, he waved it in the air and, laughing awkwardly, said that he was just playing war games, broke the previous one, so he decided to buy a new one and asked if there were any problems. Turning around, the courier adjusted his cap, smiled awkwardly, and said he was just asking. Cheng Hai stared after him intently through the doorway and thought that even though he had long known how eager ordinary people were to become adventurers, talking about such things so bluntly scared him. He closed the door and turned abruptly to the box. After taking off his clothes, he changed into chain mail and iron armor, replacing his glasses with contact lenses, and armed himself with a fire axe that he bought at a nearby fire equipment store. The main character noticed that the armor is heavy and a little tight in the chest, and looking at himself, said that he is grateful that it does not restrict movement. He stared intently at the portal to the dungeon and stepped inside. After leaving the portal, the main character found himself in the forest and noticed that the first enemy would be werewolves. He was glad that he had bought the chain mail for a good reason, and noted while waving his finger in the air that according to official information, after a newbie entered the dungeon, the adventurer's panel and exit conditions would be activated. Status, inventory, achievements, and task buttons appeared in the air. He opened his status, where it says his name, race, first adventurer rating, that his profession and nickname are missing, and the main characteristics read Strength 9, Agility 9, Physique 10, Intelligence 16, Perception 10, Charisma 11. That the basic stats of ordinary people are about 10, the weaker ones have 8, and the outstanding ones have 14, and he didn't train, so he was counting on 9, not 16. He smiled smugly and said that charisma and intelligence might not be the most useful stats at an early stage, but 16 intelligence points are not so common. Then he added that strength, agility, and physique can be improved through training, but intelligence can't. He chuckled and told himself to calm down, then decided to read the terms and conditions and clicked on the tasks button. The blue dialog box said, Murloc Hunting Season. Challenge Level 2. Current Challenger 1 of 5. Exit conditions kill any Murloc. Completion conditions destroy the Murloc squad. There are 9 trials left in this dungeon. After passing the level, the tests will be cancelled. 28 days, 18 hours and 42 minutes are left before the dungeon reset. Cheng Hai opened his mouth in shock and shouted about how he was allergic to water reptiles and whether it was impossible to pick out normal opponents for him. A Murloc with huge eyes, fins, and gills walked through the forest, armed with a spear, and made gurgling sounds. The main character's eyes appeared in the bushes, and he jumped out at the Murloc with a cry, swinging the axe. The Murloc saw this and jumped back, causing the blow to only graze his arm. The Murloc said in its own language that the captain was right, and adventurers do come into this forest. Evening came. The main character wipes sweat from his forehead, removing his helmet, and says that perhaps the difficulty of this dungeon was indicated incorrectly, standing next to a dead Murloc lying on the ground, from which an axe protruded. Cheng Hai noted that he had barely managed one, and thinking about what would happen if there were several of them, he wondered if he should go back right now. To the main character's surprise, a dialogue box appeared in front of him, saying that his level was increased. In the window with the status of the main character, the adventurer rating changed to the 2nd level and a nickname appeared, I'm with Murloc's 50-50. He got angry at the insult, picked up the Murloc spear, and decided that that was enough for today, and that he would challenge this dungeon after hiring a personal fitness trainer and improving his core stats as he went back to the portal. Chai Han walked out of the portal to his room and collapsed on the couch, moaning that he was tired a lot, adding that it was the first time he had gotten up from the couch in half a year. A dialogue box appeared in front of him, with the dungeon exit condition highlighted in green. The main character noted that the mission was completed and that strange things happen after leaving the dungeon. The dialogue box says that the adventurer has been found to have left the dungeon and that the settlement is starting. Cheng Hai chuckled and said that he was asking for some, saying that he should be given a magic bottle so that he could improve all of his stats. The dialogue box announced that the calculation was completed. It read, E-rating comment, you can order more dishes. Reward, additional standard props, standard thermos flask. The main character raised his hands in rage and shouted about what other dishes, asking if he hadn't just leveled up. Deciding that something was better than nothing, he decided to see what this thermos can do. A thermos flask appeared in the protagonist's hand. The dialogue box reported that this item is able to condense 500 milliliters of pure water daily, and that an improvement is available. In a rage, he shouted about who got the trash and threw the thermos bottle on the floor. Second day, gym building. Cheng Hai said hello and said that he had an appointment with Ko-chan. A short-haired, red-haired girl wearing a blue top with black straps said that he must be Cheng Hai and told him that the coach was waiting for him in the VIP lounge. She showed him the way, and he followed her. Cheng Hai thought about how he didn't think that a small town like Dongshan would have a trainer who specialized in providing body-shaping services for new adventurers. Such important indicators for adventurers as strength, dexterity, and endurance can be improved with the help of exercises. Cheng Hai thought hard that his book fee was barely enough to cover his expenses, but since this training would help him improve his stats, it would be worth it. The girl asked him with a smile if he was already doing fitness, and Cheng Hai said no. She asked why such expenses would be necessary, adding that a regular coach would be enough for beginners. She then looked at him with her eyes slightly closed and asked if he had become an adventurer. Cheng Hai remarked that she was quite straightforward and told her that if a person had a goal, they should hire a better coach, and added that he thought that for adventurers, a regular coach wasn't the most suitable option, flexing his hand into a fist and smiling. She replied that he should be able to then, and pulled on the door handle. The protagonist thought hard about wondering what the best coach in Dongshan looked like. The girl announced to coach and that they had come to see him. Cheng Hai saw a man with long blonde hair wearing a pink tank top wiping sweat from his face. The main character thought that this wasn't exactly what he expected, that he thought it would be a huge beefy man, and in front of him just a guy with a pretty face. A huge man twice the size of the main character, standing to the left of him and looking down from above, said that his course costs a lot of money and not everyone can afford it. The main character turned around in surprise and looked at him. Coach and Rank AAA asked him about his desire to become an adventurer. The main character does a bench press while Coach and counts. Cheng Hai's hands are shaking and he tells him that he can't do it anymore after 5 times. The coach took the barbell out of his hands and said that's all for today. Cheng Hai sits down and tries to catch his breath. The coach notes that it was 5 times 30 kilograms and you need to increase to 35 kilograms. He added that even with the discount that he is a beginner, given his weight, the result is very weak. Cheng Hai grits his teeth and thinks that he knows that his physical capabilities are below average, and that this is not enough, noting that the average figure is 50 kilograms. The man in the pink t-shirt says that the main character's foundation is weak, and notes that the limit value of 35 kilograms when converted to the adventurer's indicator should be 9. Coach An says that the values of strength, endurance, and agility of ordinary people are relatively balanced, and their margin of error is small, and it is almost impossible to improve these indicators in a month. Still breathing heavily, Cheng Hai turns to them and asks how long it will take him. The coach replies that everything depends on him, and if he practices every day, then in a month and a half you can reach the value of 11, and after the transformation he will become an adventurer of B rank and will feel much stronger. The main character replied that he understood and said that he would train according to this plan. He asked how to pay for it, and the coach told him to drop it on WeChat. The man in the pink tank top was glad that he wasn't going to be studying alone anymore and introduced himself as Zhu Mao. Cheng Hai introduced himself in response, saying that he was a writer. Cheng Hai and Zhu Mao are sitting at the bar in a burger joint. Zhu Mao asks why he signed up to coach and adding that although he is a professional, it is not cheap. He asked why there was a rush, saying that classes at home or a simpler coach could also improve physical abilities. Then he said that usually only adventurers with experience or who have signed a long-term contract with the association use the services of such a coach, adding that if he was not an adventurer in Wales, he would not be able to afford the services of Anne's coach while holding a bitten burger in his hand. Holding a ketchup fries in his hand, Cheng Hai replied with a smile that he was not short of money, so he was spending his fees, explaining that since he had a clear goal, he decided to find the best coach to lay a solid foundation. Zhu Mao propped his head on his palm and said that he thought he had discovered the entrance to the dungeon and was forced to become an adventurer. He gave the main character a cold look and said that since he was just planning on becoming one, he should teach him something so that they wouldn't try to trick him later. Zhu Mao turned to the main character with a smile and there was a sign above his head, "Leave him to die." He said that the first time you enter a dungeon, each adventurer gets a corresponding title based on their stats and they can choose whether to wear it or not. He explained that attributes and stats when leveling up don't go unnoticed by other players, and that hunters who specialize in finding low-level dungeons often hide their title because it would be strange if they had it displayed. He said that the hunter in turn would always know who became an adventurer and would follow that person to find the entrance to the dungeon. Zhu Mao noticed that Cheng Hai didn't react and concluded that Cheng Hai wasn't really an adventurer, but just a writer with money who intended to become an adventurer, as if there was nothing wrong with that. Adjusting his glasses, Chai Hai said with interest on his face that he would remember. Despite the stony expression on his face, Cheng Hai thought that it was a good thing that he didn't use his title, otherwise he would have been exposed today. Zhu Mao said that Kochin must have already finished with the contract and called for the protagonist to go. Kochin is sitting at a table with a laptop, surrounded by awards and cups, in front of a girl with red hair. He says that Cheng Hai is a fairly well-known writer specializing in adventure novels, and that it's not surprising that he has the financial resources and motivation to attend his classes. He concluded that he wanted to improve his fitness so that he could participate in the adventure himself. The girl said that he also doesn't have any special deadline requirements, so it doesn't look like he found the entrance to the dungeon and he has a month left to complete the task. Coach said with a grim face that the probability that Cheng Hai was an adventurer or that he had found the entrance to the dungeon was extremely low, and said that if Zhu Mao didn't say anything when they returned, proceed as usual. Coach stands up from his seat with a grim face. The title, Rookie Killer, is visible above his head. He said that as long as the Dongshan Elite Dungeon trial didn't disappear, he definitely wouldn't miss out on the opportunity to earn some extra money. Zhu Mao and Cheng Hai enter the room where Cochin and his assistant are waiting for them. He notices the title above Cochin's head, but doesn't show it. Cochin tells him that the contract has been drawn up, and if there are no problems after reading it, he can sign it. The main character agreed with a smile, nervous in his head about how even the coach is an adventurer. The girl showed him where to go. Cochin narrowed his eyes as he looked at Zhu Mao and noticed that the main character had a normal expression, and that the latter didn't pay much attention to the inscriptions above his head after looking at him, concluding that he didn't look like the one who had just discovered the dungeon. He asked if the man had done anything wrong. Scratching his neck, Zhu Mao replied that he couldn't because they had a contract. Zhu Mao is a level 6 contract adventurer. When Cochin left, he said that there was no need to constantly monitor the main character. Cheng Hai put the papers on the table and said that everything was ready. The girl gave him a copy of it and asked him to wait a bit, saying that Cochin would test it. The main character is trying to catch his breath while sitting on a treadmill. The coach says that this is enough, writing something down on paper, and concludes that the assessment of his physical form is extremely disappointing. He said that they would not do an agility test, and next week they would focus on strength exercises and fitness, asking at what time it was convenient for him. Wiping his face, the main character replied that he was always comfortable. Before leaving, Cochin told him to come back tomorrow at 10 in the morning and not eat anything greasy for breakfast. Lying face down on the bed, Cheng Hai says that he didn't think the largest chain of fitness centers in China would do such a thing, and that they just use the body shaping services for adventurers as bait. He added that if he made any mistakes, they would immediately understand that he was hiding something and eliminate him. He thought that it wasn't so surprising now that there was a similar coach in his town, and assumed that there were some all over the country. Then it dawned on him, and he sat up excitedly. He realized that all services related to adventurers were similar to this one, including the chain mail he bought. Looking at his phone, the protagonist thought that he was lucky that he realized in time that it was unwise to buy chain mail and weapons in the same store. Otherwise it would definitely arouse suspicion, and that he underestimated the risks of being an adventurer. Looking at the portal, he thought that he needed to adjust his plans. Cheng Hai walked out of the portal in the forest, clad in armor, and said that he originally thought to return here after he finished training. But he didn't expect that the real world would be so violent that low-level adventurers were waiting at every turn. Looking at the interface buttons, he tiredly said that even though he was lucky to avoid trouble today, he wouldn't always be lucky, and that the only way to level up was to take the risk. The exit conditions on the dialog box changed to a pair of Murloc eyeballs. Noticing this, the protagonist remembered the Murloc he killed yesterday and went to where his corpse was, saying that he didn't know if yesterday's eyeball would come off. On the ground lies a Nod Murloc with its body cut open. While holding his nose, Cheng Hai noticed that the internal organs had been eaten and asked who had done it. He noticed that the eyes weren't eaten and was glad that he didn't have to fight, so he sat down on the ground next to the dead Murloc and said that he would just walk around and make a few notes about the place. A Murloc appeared behind him and shouted at him in its own language, asking if he was the killer. The main character exhaled when he realized they were Murlocs and shouted at him that he could make him one when the second one appeared. Cheng Hai started running away with all his might, shouting that he couldn't beat two people and needed to run. Evening came. The main character and the Murloc stand side by side, trying to catch their breath. The Murloc fiercely pointed its spear at Cheng Hai and shouted in its own language. The latter, grinning, wiped his face and told him that he was going to die any minute, but everything was bragging and asked him if he understood. He pointed gloatingly next to the Murloc and shouted that it and its companion had split up, which surprised the Murloc. Cheng Hai smiled maliciously with the axe in his hands, looking down at the Murloc. With a blow of his axe, he sliced it in half. The second Murloc jumped out of the bushes and charged at the main character, shouting. He turned and smiled ominously. The Murloc was startled. Swinging the axe, he shouted at him to run, running after him. The dialogue box says that an adventurer has been found to have left the dungeon, and announces the beginning of the settlement. The following dialogue box says that his performance as an adventurer is low and there is no reward. Cheng Hai gritted his teeth in surprise, thinking that he was clearly better this time and asking why there was no reward. Leaning back on the sofa, he asked if the drop rate in dungeons of this level was really that low. Stretching his hand up in front of him, he thought about how if that was the case, adventurers wouldn't be able to earn money and assumed that there was something that everyone knew except for him. Looking at his phone, he considered asking Zumao and the coach tomorrow, but decided to make sure that they definitely didn't think he was a dungeon owner and a novice adventurer. Day 2. Zumao asked again about how Zumao and Coach didn't show up, and the girl replied that Zumao had gone to another city and would be back in a couple of days, and Coach was busy today and wouldn't be back until noon. He replied that he would go to the VIP lounge. Cheng Hai runs on a treadmill with a mask on his face. Zumao asks Coach about the fact that the main character has been training so much for the past few days that he wasn't there, to which the coach replies in the affirmative. He notes that he is quite persistent and that the moment is not far off when he will raise his strength and agility to 11. He explained that if he continues like this and is not slowed down by injuries, then his strength, agility, and overall body condition can rise to 12 pretty quickly. Zumao turned to the coach with a smile and asked if he was considering recruiting him, explaining that he was a rich and persistent candidate and would definitely become a successful adventurer in the future. The coach replied that he had asked him while Zumao was away, but he refused and said that he wanted to become a black adventurer, that is, not affiliated with associations and companies, not subject to supervision and restrictions, and having more freedom, and then work solo. In response, Zumao shrugged and said that they each had their own plans. Cheng Hai is lying on the treadmill, trying to catch his breath. Zumao walked up to him and said with a smile that he was working too hard and would get hurt if he trained so hard, adding that he had a whole year ahead of him. He sat up and replied that he wanted to become an adventurer as soon as possible, and that he was afraid that if it took too long, his finances would simply run out. Zumao thought about the price of an adventurer's quota on the black market, which only increases over time, and agreed. Cheng Hai sits at a table in a burger joint and stares intently at his burger, thinking that given the fact that the coach tried to recruit him, he can be sure that they've ruled out the possibility that he's an adventurer, even if he's an entry-level one, and now it's just a matter of finding the right time. Zumao walked over to the table with a tray of food in his hands and asked him why he was frozen and what he was thinking. He replied with a smile that he was just tired and a little distracted. Zumao replied with a serious face, holding a French fry with ketchup in his hand, that it wouldn't work that way and the constant exertion of overwork only increases the risk of injury, and injury will slow him down. Cheng Hai replied that he had already realized that the amount of training needed to be reduced, and, pretending to remember casually, asked when he had managed to recoup the initial investment in the adventurer profession. Zumao shook his head and said that he hadn't succeeded yet, and he needed to wait until his level reached at least 11 before he could think about making something pay off. The main character asked in surprise why after level 11. Zumao explained that this is because low-level adventurers, especially those from 1 to 5, are useless to mess with, and the survival rate is lower than average only in campaigns led by veterans. He said that adventurers without ambition usually choose mixed levels, and at 6-10 levels, the difficulty of the mission increases significantly. Information about monsters is more valuable, so the guys who are before start working as information collectors at this stage. He added that the survival rate is not as high as in the previous stage, and said that only at level 11, when the difficulty level does not allow mixing, do adventurers start to make a profit, and adventurers at this level already have sufficient strength and agility. He explained that equipment, items, and skill books, everything that helps you level up, are sold at a very high price. Cheng Hai said that he didn't understand why level 6-10 adventurers didn't actively prepare if a level 11 dungeon was so dangerous. Zumao replied that for many reasons. He started to explain that first of all, the Adventurers Association doesn't officially force adventurers to attack dungeons, so most of them prefer to retire in order to return to normal life when they reach level 11. He added that few adventurers make it to elite dungeons, and that compared to levels 11-15, which have great advantages in addition to risks, at level 6-10. Relying on information gathering and logistics can recoup the initial investment and even get a little bit on top, and that such people do not need to risk their lives to survive. Up to level 11-15, Cheng Hai realized that this was why Zumao decided to stay at the 6th level for a longer time. Looking at his phone while sitting on the couch at home, Cheng Hai says that he really learned a lot, and that it's not surprising that he can't find any useful information because most of the community does this just to make money. He said that they only provide information to others, and in the future, all owners of low-level dungeons will be eliminated. Recalling Zumao's words, he thought that what surprised him the most was that in the dungeon, the reward can only be obtained once, even if the mission is completed several times. He looked at the portal and thought that looking at it from this point of view, the only value that could be taken out was the quota for automatically turning all those lost in it into adventurers. The main character changed into his armor and thought that given the risks associated with selling adventurous places, and the fact that he is not short of money. He will try to clear this dungeon as much as possible, and then consider whether to continue his career as an adventurer. He decided to try the method that Zhu Mao had taught him and focus on gathering information early on before thinking about the rest. The dialogue box says, Working Season for Murlocs. Challenge Level 2. Exit conditions: find a lake. Completion conditions: destroy the Murloc squad. There are 7 tests left in this dungeon. After completing a level, the tests will be cancelled. There are 19 days, 18 hours and 43 minutes left until the dungeon reset. The main character was surprised that this mission also did not require combat, and was glad that he took advantage of Zhu Mao's experience and bought a drone, because finding the lake without it would not be the easiest task. Murlocs run through the forest after a creature with a large red tail. One of the Murlocs spots the drone and shouts something in their own language. Cheng Hai looks in surprise at the screen on the drone's remote control and sees 4 Murlocs and one large orange Murloc with large pointed swimming trunks looking at the drone. The big orange Murloc let out a loud growl, baring its huge teeth in its mouth. The Murlocs scattered in different directions, disappearing into the forest vegetation. Cheng Hai, looking intently at the screen, wondered if it was a Murloc, and concluded that although its appearance and aura were different from those Murlocs he had fought before, he was sure that it was also a Murloc, but of a higher level and with more advanced abilities. He decided to complete his mission first and then return to the search for the orange Murloc. Looking around, the Murlocs emerged from the bushes. Simple Murlocs looked at the drone and pointed at it, while orange Murlocs looked in the opposite direction. A few minutes later, Cheng Hai announced that he had found the lake. The drone flies over a lake located among the trees. Sitting on the ground near a tree, the main character, smiling, says that it is not surprising that there are so many Murlocs in this forest, since there has been such a large lake all this time. He said that the exit conditions must be met. The task dialog box turned red and the exit condition changed to a fake lake. A black dialog box with red text announced that the map was being changed and the dungeon's rating had been increased. The main character looked questioningly in the direction from which the sound came, and found a large orange Murloc looking at him. Sputtering and making a loud noise, the Murloc lunged towards the main character and smashed the drone's remote control with a blow of its clawed hand. Cheng Hai jumped back and took out an axe. He noted that he was glad that he managed to react to the Murloc's attack, otherwise it would have caused him a serious injury. He glanced with annoyance at the drone's control panel lying on the ground, broken into pieces. Then he checked himself, decided that this wasn't the time to think about it, and this Murloc was too fast, and he would have to be careful. 4 simple green Murlocs emerged from the forest behind the orange Murloc, and the protagonist counted them, noting that they were all around him. The orange Murloc lunged at Cheng Hai and struck him in the shoulder with its claws, shattering his mail shirt and leaving him with a wound. He noted the Murloc's speed by looking at the blood spurting from the wound on his shoulder. The Murloc looked back at the main character and asked in its own language what was going on. Cheng Hai thought that if it wasn't for the chain mail, he would probably have lost an arm by now, and wondered if it was true that novice adventurers had to deal with such creatures. Standing in a threatening pose, the orange Murloc asked in its own language why this person was so difficult to kill, then shouted at the other Murlocs not to just stare. Turning around, the main character noticed that the Murlocs began to approach him. Gritting his teeth, he glanced at the orange Murloc and thought that it would be fine if he only had to fight it, but he would also have to spend energy on ordinary Murlocs, and noticed that the difficulty of this dungeon was much higher than the stated one. Looking back at the portal behind the trees, he decided to run, and a red system warning caught his attention. The dialog box highlighted the text in red and warned that all achievements will be cancelled when you exit the dungeon. In front of the cave entrance, there are goblin corpses and small lights. A punch smashes the stone wall of the cave. A bespectacled man with a book in his hand tells the man with red hair, calling him Quan Chun, that he is just taking out his anger on the dead man, and slams his book shut. The guy with glasses is called Bu Jiaming, and he's a level 5 contract adventurer ranked in the top best companies for adventurers, and his title is 5 fireballs that destroy everything in their path. Quan Chong turned around and asked, "So what?" He is a level 5 contract adventurer, also ranked in the top best companies for adventurers, and his nickname is the Overbearing Fist of Rage. In front of him is a huge goblin body slammed into the cave wall and covered with a dent from punching. Quan Chong says it's because he's too weak to resist. Bu Jiaming replied that it would be strange if he could, even considering that his stated 5th level is quite equal to the 9th, saying that only Quan Chong would be lucky enough to encounter such a monster in an entry-level dungeon. Quan Chong said that he wanted to face the legendary bug monster that can only be encountered in the next stage of the dungeon, and that it doesn't scare him because he can always get a coupon to upgrade a miraculous item as compensation, and that he is convinced that he is destined to become a legendary adventurer. Quan Chong smiled confidently as he left. Bu Jiaming thought about how they were only at the 5th level, and noted that the monster he was targeting was truly legendary. He wondered how Quan Chong planned to get such a rare coupon, and assumed that Quan Chong had just blurted it out without thinking. The dialogue box says, challenge level is unknown. Exit conditions. Last 3 minutes with an abnormal Murloc with high combat power. After completing the task, you will receive an additional compensation, a coupon for improving a wonderful item. Cheng Hai angrily shouted at the window that he wanted to escape, and asked about how it wanted to pretend that it wasn't there. The orange Murloc leapt at the protagonist, raising its paw to strike, and shouted in its own language that it was finished. Cheng Hai stares intently at the Murloc's paw approaching him. Blood spurts out, and his helmet flies off his head. Cheng Hai fell to the ground on his knees, and blood is coming out of his head, which is raised up, and he thinks that this is the end. The orange Murloc speaks in its own language about being disappointed and being bored, and that leaves it to other Murlocs. The main character stares blankly at the ground, the Murloc spear in front of his face, and he thinks that if he could see the future, he would never have entered this dungeon and become an adventurer. He thinks of the best-selling bookstore window. He thought that he knew what he had signed up for, and that he had often dreamed of getting into the dungeon over the past couple of years. He remembers his joy at first defeating the Murloc and the hard training. Then he thinks about how he was wondering if he would become like the characters in his novels, who had to go through many dangerous situations and experience all the joys and tribulations of an adventurer's career firsthand. He remembers talking to Zhu Mao. Cheng Hai is kneeling on the ground, blood dripping from his head to the ground. He thinks that he is afraid of death and that he is a coward who doesn't really know how to fight. He snatches up his axe and cuts one of the Murlocs in half, shouting that he is also an adventurer and can't die here. The orange Murloc turns around in disbelief and looks at what is happening. Swinging his axe, surrounded by Murlocs, he tells himself to think about what trump card he has and what he can use. He remembers his title Murloc Fighter 1v1 and shouts that he wants to use it. A blue dialogue box appears above his head, stating that the Murloc Fighter 1v1 title has been used. It says, title effect automatically finds the nearest strongest Murloc. The user who uses this title gains the target's strength, agility, and perception. The following dialogue box announces that the title has increased his stats, strength +1, agility +8, perception +6. Cheng Hai swings the axe at the Murloc, attacking him with a quick movement. His blue title is visible above his head, and he cuts the Murloc in half. He notes that his body has become lighter and stronger, and he feels that all the Murloc's movements have slowed down, suggesting that his vision has also improved. Glancing threateningly at the remaining 2 simple Murlocs, who were visibly nervous, the protagonist thought that in this state he could deal with them. After a moment of silence, the orange Murloc said in its own language that it was strange, and asked why the man had suddenly become so strong and what he had done. There are 4 Murloc corpses lying behind the main character, and he heads towards the orange Murloc, holding an axe in one hand and a Murloc spear in the other. With a sinister smile, he told him that they were now alone. The orange Murloc shouted at him in its own language not to get cocky just because it managed to get a couple of its low-level bipods. Cheng Hai thought that he didn't know why, but this Murloc's strength was incredible, and that even in this chainmail, he couldn't match its strength and speed. He threw the axe to the ground, grabbing the spear in both hands, and thought about how he only had one chance, and he only had to leave his defenses in one place, and the helmet would have to be removed, because this Murloc would use a direct attack method to reach the speed limit. The main character reflected that he had determined the Murloc's attack style and route, and he needed to give up the head guard to use it as bait, thereby winning the chance to exchange injuries and severely injure the opponent. And if he did not take this opportunity, then he would not have another chance to do something like this. He sighed and thought that he wasn't sure he'd survive this, and it was really terrible. Finding the moment to attack and swinging his spear, he decided that he had to try and get out of it. The main character and the orange Murloc were behind each other, exchanging blows. The spear pierced through the Murloc's mouth and throat, remaining in its body. Cheng Hai chuckled with a blank stare, blood gushed out from his neck, and he fell to the ground, asking about how he was good for nothing. The orange Murloc, trembling, clutched at the spear stuck in its body, trying unsuccessfully to pull it out, and shouted in its own language that the fact that this weak little human managed to injure it was ridiculous. Closing his eyes, he thought that this was a nightmare and fell to the ground. A blue dialogue box appeared in front of the fainting Cheng Hai, announcing that the death of an abnormal Murloc with high combat power had been recorded and the mission completed, and announcing that the settlement was underway. Then the following message appeared on the dialogue box: calculation completed. Comment: for a novice adventurer, you have proven yourself to be incredible without fear of death. Received a new title, Escape Death. Hidden bonus, Death Escapee Certificate. One-time item received, Magic Item Upgrade Coupon. Friendly reminder, using this coupon on the thermos bottle that you received earlier will help you solve your problem. Lying in a pool of his own blood, Cheng Hai tapped the button for a regular thermos flask, and it appeared in his hand. He said to apply the coupon to a regular thermos flask. The thermos flask glowed and turned into a glass jar with a red potion inside. A dialogue box labeled as Miracle Item Delivery announced that it was a magic blood restoration potion, and described its effect. Daily produces a potion with a random flavor that can be used to heal injuries and restore physical strength. Cheng Hai drank the red potion, and the wounds on his body healed. Exhaling heavily, he collapsed to the ground and noted how much it refreshed him. After a few minutes, he sat up and sighed, noticing that the wounds on his neck had already healed. The main character opened the status window and noticed that his perception increased slightly and was equal to 11. He asked what the exit conditions were now, and when he opened the task window, he drew attention to the conditions for completing them, which said to destroy the pond with the brood of Murlocs. Getting up from the ground and gathering up the spears of the defeated Murlocs, he decided that he definitely couldn't do it right now and entered the portal. When he came out on the other side of the portal in his house, he noticed that the entrance to the dungeon had increased. He touched the portal with his hand, and the electric shock pushed his hand away. The blue dialogue box said, "Insufficient level, the entrance to the dungeon is closed. The number of trials in the dungeon is 10. After clearing the dungeon, the number of trials will be 0. Before the dungeon expansion, 89 days, 23 hours, 42 minutes. Cheng Hai was surprised to see that his level was insufficient, and the level of the dungeon had increased. He said that the conditions he met to exit the dungeon had to belong to a higher level dungeon, and it was no wonder that the difficulty of the mission increased so much and that he received an improved reward. A blue dialogue box reported that adventurers were found to have no job and suggested applying for a transfer certificate to the hidden profession of Deathwalker. The main character remembered that there was someone on the forum who emphasized the importance of the profession. In the forum post, it is written that the 4 elements of an adventurer's power are the main characteristics, title, inventory, and profession, and the most important among these 4 is the profession. Cheng Hai clicked on the confirm button, and the dialog box announced the change of profession, showing the download slider. A dark purple energy enveloped him, which surprised the protagonist. In the status window, the profession Deathwalker appeared. The dialog box announced the effect of following death. 1. Perception plus 5. 2. The closer the adventurer is to death, the greater the strength and agility. Stat points increase from up to 4. 3. Unlock rewards. Cheng Hai was surprised to see that his perception was now 16, and found that even with his eyes closed, his brain could accurately imagine and perceive every corner of his living room. He thought hard that he was afraid to imagine how people with a perception score of 20 would see the world. He remembered that his first title had synchronized his basic stats, strength, speed, and perception with the Murlocs, and wondered what the effect of his new title was. The dialog box reported that the effect is triggered when the wearer is seriously injured or dies, or encounters an enemy whose strength is slightly greater than their own, strength plus 4, agility plus 4, perception plus 4. He reasoned that this bonus adds 4 points to strength, agility, and perception, and its effect is similar to his new profession. Then, he noticed that he would be able to gain plus 8 strength, agility, and perception in the new status under extreme conditions. He grinned nervously and said that if he was brave enough, he would be able to activate the self-harm effect on his own during the encounter with the enemy, kill the enemy, and then use a recovery potion. He was glad that thanks to the potion, his options were limitless and he no longer had to worry about overexerting his muscles due to training, and he could train as much as he wanted. A month later, Cheng Hai holds a barbell in the gym. His muscles noticeably increased and, exhaling, he lifted the barbell with large weights above his head. Zumao, who was standing next to him and wiping his face with a towel, looked at him in surprise and thought to himself, who would have thought that a rookie would be able to achieve such a result in less than 2 months, and it usually takes a whole year to do such a thing. He thought that if it had been anyone else, he would have been taken to the intensive care unit long ago, which means that he has an amazing physique, and suggested that it might be 17-18. Thinking that Kochan had made a big mistake, he walked up to Cheng Hai and threw him a bottle, congratulating him on how confident he was that his strength and agility had already reached level 12, and with his current level, he would definitely be able to meet the conditions to exit the dungeon. The main character caught the bottle and began to drink from it in large sips. Zumao asked him if he would like to join Whales, and he replied with a smile that he didn't want to be held back by any contractual obligations. Zumao spread his hands and shook his head, saying that he thought they could go on raids together as colleagues. Cheng Hai smilingly told him that even if they weren't colleagues, they could still go on raids together, and told him that he was going to purchase a couple of dungeon spots after asking him for advice. He thought about it. Cheng Hai asked in surprise, a non-specialized alliance. Then he asked if he understood correctly that they were the largest non-specialized group. Raising his palm up, Zumao replied that if he was going to buy a place in a dungeon on the black market, he would advise him to choose a place in a low-level dungeon that was covered by the guarantee of a non-specialized alliance. The main character asked why. He explained to him that usually deals involving the sale of adventure receipts are accompanied by quite large risks for both the seller and the buyer, and usually sellers are afraid that some veteran will pretend to be a novice, and buyers that after receiving the money, the seller will simply disappear. He added that this does not apply to those transactions that accompany a non-specialized alliance, although they do have quite a large commission, and in transactions that relate to the purchase of an adventurer's seat and other things related to dungeons, they ensure that the seller is in contact with the buyer and that they can be trusted. Sitting on the bed in his room, Cheng Hai looks at his phone and says that he has checked all the available ads, and out of all of them, only the seller from Yunzhou City seems to be more or less reliable, and he has the guarantee of a non-specialized alliance. On the phone screen, a chat is opened with the seller, where Cheng Hai is signed as a Dongshan citizen who likes to write, and the seller is an old driver from Yunzhou. Cheng Hai asked if there were any more seats, to which the vendor replied that they had recruited 6 people and were waiting for 2 more to start the raid. The main character asked how they would exchange and is waiting for an answer. 2 days later, Cheng Hai is standing in a night park in Yunzhou City looking at his phone. He texted the salesman that he was there, and the salesman replied that he could see him. A man with a beefy body, a beard, a white t-shirt on his hairy chest, orange pants, and a jacket tied around his waist ran up to him. He announced his presence loudly, and Cheng Hai turned around. He asked him again if he was really an old driver from Yunzhou, and the latter replied in the affirmative, extending his hand and asking if Cheng Hai was really a Dongshan citizen who liked to write. Cheng Hai greeted him and they shook hands. The salesman turned around and ran, hurrying the main character, announcing that they would now sign a contract and go to the dungeon. The contractor of a non-specialized alliance in a purple suit and pointy-eared glasses signed the paper with a pentagram with a smile and announced to the audience that this contract consists of 3 points. The first is that the final payment of the buyer will be in a special account that they will provide, and that the seller will help them in performing the above-mentioned services, and they will transfer the final payment to the merchant's account will only be charged after the adventurers leave the dungeon. He continued by explaining that after entering a dungeon, the seller is prohibited from doing things that might violate the security agreement, ignore dangerous situations, or take force against buyers, and the buyer is prohibited from divulging the location of the entrance to a given dungeon. He asked if anyone else had any questions about the contract. A man in a yellow sleeveless jacket with the nickname Leader and a man with long white hair with the nickname Liang answered that there were no questions. Cheng Hai and an elderly man with white hair with a confused expression with the nickname Hateful Hatred answered that there were no questions. The contractor smiled with his sharp teeth and said that in this case the contract would take effect, and the pentagram on paper turned yellow. Yellow pentagrams lit up on the adventurer's hands. The fat guy with the nickname You Don't Mind Me Making Fun of You and the thin guy in a white shirt with the nickname Security Squad Leader were surprised to find glowing pentagrams on their hands. Putting the pen back in the breast pocket of his jacket, the contractor announced that this was the end of his work, and as he left, he waved to them and said that he hoped they would do more work in the future. The salesman dusted off his hands and smilingly told everyone not to disperse, and he would lead them to the dungeon entrance. At an abandoned construction site, a salesman points out the blue entrance to the dungeon to adventurers. A man in a business suit and glasses with the nickname Dungeon Finance Specialist admired that the entrance was indeed well hidden, and it was no wonder that neither the authorities nor the townspeople had been able to find it for so long. The leader and Liang exchanged glances, and the leader smiled. With a smile, pointing at the portal with his hand, the seller invited them to enter the portal in turn. They came out in a level 4 dungeon forest, the Witch Forest. A thin man in a jacket asked who was waiting for them in the dungeon, turned to the salesman and asked if they were newbies. The fat guy jumps up and down in glee, shouting confirmation that he's an adventurer. The seller grinned and answered in the affirmative and said that they even seemed to be traveling. Cheng Hai noticed the conversation between the shop assistant and the man in the jacket and noticed that there were originally 2 of them. The salesman clapped his hands and asked for a moment of attention. He told them to repeat loudly after him, "Status window." The adventurers did as he said, and interface buttons appeared in front of them. The salesperson explained to the adventurers that this window will show them their characteristics as an adventurer, and that by scrolling down below, they can check the details of the current mission, and that the content of the status window is only visible to them, so they don't have to worry that someone else will see the information about them. The man in the jacket announced that they could now tell them their exit conditions so they could sort them out. The fat guy, looking at his status window, clutched his head and shouted that he had very low stats. Cheng Hai looked back at him and looked at his tasks. The dialogue box read, "Exit conditions, hear the Banshee voice. Clearing conditions, kill the Banshee." The main character noted in horror that there was no Banshee among the list of newbie dungeons. Shanghai was afraid that this dungeon had the same bug as the dungeon in his apartment, and he thought that based on the survivor's mistake. If the monster from the beginner's dungeon wasn't included in the beginner's guide, there were two options: either it was an extremely rare case, or all the adventurers who had disappeared to encounter it, they died. The pentagram on the bespectacled man's arm screamed that the man had violated the security agreement and given a false condition for exiting the dungeon. Shanghai noticed this. The leader of the security team, smiling slyly and keeping his hands in his pants pockets, asked about the fact that they hadn't even started yet, and someone had already managed to break the security agreement by looking at the man with glasses. The leader looked at him in silence, and the man with glasses, smiling nervously, shouted that this was some kind of bug, and his condition for leaving was to collect valuable herbs. The man in the jacket looked at the man threateningly and said that the contractor's contract wasn't always able to give out 100% correct information, but with such a newcomer, he definitely couldn't have such problems, and concluded that his condition for going out was definitely not to collect valuable herbs, and he lied to them. The man fell to the ground in fear, trying to find words, when the leader came up to him, put his hand on his shoulder, and told the man in the jacket that he had only recently become an adventurer and didn't know all the rules yet, so it was normal for him to make mistakes, and asked for another chance. The leader lightly nudged the man with his hand. He clasped his hands in supplication and asked him to forgive him and give him another chance. After a short pause, the man in the jacket agreed. The seller asked everyone to announce their conditions for exiting the dungeon, and clarified that they should not be mistaken. The man said that his mission was to find the Lake Banshee. The fat guy said that his mission was to hear the Banshee's voice. Shanghai said that his mission was to look at the Banshee for 10 seconds. The other adventurer said that he also needed to find the Banshee. The man in blazers thoughtfully listed the missions he had just heard. Liang, who was standing next to the worried, hateful man, asked if these missions were dangerous. The man replied that it all depends on the situation, and told them not to be afraid because they will not have any problems with them. Hateful Hate put his hand on his chest, trying to calm down, and said that it wasn't so bad yet. The salesman turned to them and told them that he would take them to the witch lakes in the forest and told them to keep up. They came to the edge of a forest lake. The man in blazers called up the adventurers panel and took out a harmonica. The leader of the security team asked the salesman what he was doing, and the salesman replied with a smile that he was summoning a lake banshee. A man in a jacket plays the harmonica. He asks the seller how he found out the method of calling her, to which he replied that this is a secret of the company. A girl with light blue hair and pointed ears poked her head out of the water. It flew up into the air, and the fat guy pointed at it and shouted that he had found it. The leader and the man with glasses said that they completed their mission by looking at the dialogue boxes. Shanghai looks intently at the banshee and counts to 10, then calls up the status window that says that the exit condition has been met. The salesman told them to use earplugs because the banshees would sing their song. The fat guy asked, putting earplugs in his ears, what would happen if they were not inserted. Picking his ear, the salesman replied that witch chanting would destroy his brain, adding that a first-level beginner who had just become an adventurer would surely die immediately. The fat guy covered his ears with his hands in horror, while Hateful Hate and the bespectacled man screamed in fear. The man in the jacket continues to play the harmonica, and the banshee begins to sing back, raising his hand in the air. The nose of the bespectacled man and the fat guy started to bleed, and their faces turned red. Shanghai noticed that his nose was bleeding, even though he only heard the beginning of her song. He was glad that he was wearing earplugs, otherwise he would have been dead by now. He thought that this was to be expected of a creature from a dungeon that wasn't listed in the beginner's guide. The man in blazers stopped playing the harmonica, moving it away from his lips. The banshee noticed this and dived back into the water. The man waved to the adventurers, explaining that everyone had been able to complete their mission, and added that they could return the same way they came. The leader of the guard squad, wiping the blood from his nose, retorted that he had done a little research before coming here and found out that the plants and minerals from the dungeons were of great value. He said that he was sure they were in a hurry to send them off just to collect everything alone. The man in the jacket stared at him in silence with a dark look. Smiling smugly, the leader of the guard squad said that they had paid for everything and asked why they couldn't collect valuable herbs and minerals in the dungeon to restore the blood loss. The salesman shouted at him that it wasn't in the contract. He replied that there were no rules against it either, and the salesman gritted his teeth. Shanghai asked Wu Liang about the fact that adventurers can collect herbs and minerals. He replied that in fact, most adventurers can't pass through customs, and their main method of making a profit is collecting resources and information about monsters. Turning to the leader of the security team, the man in the jacket clarified that he believed that once the task was completed, they could not take measures against them within the framework of the contract, so that they would not do anything stupid. He smiled wickedly and asked the man in the jacket if that was the case. Smiling maliciously back, the man told him that there was one thing he hadn't considered. Liang stiffened. The man in the jacket said that he didn't sign the contract with them and took out an oblong object from the inventory. Leader Liang blocked his path by crossing his hands, and he asked what they were doing. Liang pounded his fist. The title of combat expert was displayed above his head, and he said that he wouldn't work without it. The leader said with a grin that he thought his argument made sense because it was just herbs and minerals and they weren't worth making such a fuss about. The vendor shouted that according to the contract, if he didn't exit the dungeon, they wouldn't receive the final payment, and if he died due to collecting resources, they would all suffer losses. The leader, to the seller's surprise, told him that he could protect them in exchange for resources on their part. The salesman smiled and held up the palm of his hand, apologizing and saying that they weren't willing to take that risk. The leader clarified with a smile that it was out of fear of taking risks and suggested that there were other secrets in this dungeon, and they were afraid that they would discover them during the resource gathering, and the vendor gritted his teeth nervously. He told the leader that he was far from a novice and had come here for a mission. The veins on the salesman's face bulged. He called out to the man in the jacket, calling him Liao, who was standing in front of Liang with gritted teeth, asking what he was doing. Liang told Liao that he should see for himself which of the two was stronger. Liao stared at him in silence, gritting his teeth in anger. He put the guns away and told them to do whatever they wanted and announced that they were leaving, much to the surprise of the salesman. The salesman ran after him. Hateful Hate asked in surprise that they would just take it and leave. The bespectacled man adjusted his glasses and said that the leader who spoke on their behalf was actually a much more experienced adventurer than these two. The leader placed a hand on Liang's shoulder, who calmly closed his eyes, and the title team leader was displayed above his head. He said while pointing his finger at Liang that he wasn't that strong unlike him. Shanghai tensed up and thought that according to what Zhu Mao had taught him, a true contract master would not allow an adventurer disguised as a novice to enter the dungeon so as not to lose a buyer, concluding that it was simply illogical. The leader gave a thumbs-up gesture and told the adventurers to choose. They can act on their own or join them. He explained that those who work alone keep all the profits for themselves, and those who join them will give half of the customs fee to them. Hateful Hate was surprised at how much it was. The fat guy replied with a smile that they only covered half of it, and their goal was to pass the level. He added that the normal fee for newbies was 10% or less, and if they gave half of it, they would still be 90% ahead of the newbies, and told him to stop being stingy. The bespectacled man, trembling and smiling, was surprised that just 2 months after all his accounts were blocked, he would be able to change his life so abruptly. Hateful Hate scratched the back of his head and asked the leader if these were really favorable terms. The leader, with a sinister smile, replied that it was up to them to some extent whether the newcomers could complete the dungeon, and that the reward for completing it would not be long in coming. Hateful Hate asked if just getting half of it meant that he would still get more than most level 7 adventurers after reaching it. The leader, without changing his face, replied that if he did not waste basic resources, he would really succeed. Hateful Hate, a bespectacled man and a fat guy asked him to let them join them. Walking through the depths of the forest, the salesperson tells Liao that before signing the contract, it was stipulated that it only involves refusing to complete the mission, and it doesn't cover everything else, so they had to finish the mission first. Liao, after a short pause, replied that it was almost done, and they were far away, so they didn't need to be followed anymore, and they didn't need to interfere anymore. With a smile, the salesman told him that his acting skills had improved significantly this time, and that he really thought that he believed that he couldn't beat Liang. Liao calmly replied that he really couldn't beat him, which surprised the salesman. He continued that he was still afraid of him, otherwise they wouldn't have tried to negotiate. The salesman smiled nervously and said he understood, asking if he thought they could do it. Liao replied with a grim face that the probability was not too high, and the title of combat expert would not help him, and the leader, despite his charisma, like his friend, is only at the 5th level, and he has no real means to be afraid of. Narrowing his eyes, Liao added that only 1, at most 2, lucky people would be able to get out of this dungeon alive. Throwing his hands behind his head, the salesman doubted, saying that he thought it was the same last time. The leader hands out swords to the adventurers, and they look at them curiously and try them out. The leader says that now that they've decided to work together, he won't hide anything anymore, and said that he can increase the random stat of his teammates who trusted him with their lives. Description of the group leader title effect. 1. Charisma +3. 2. After becoming a leader +1 to all attributes. 3. 50% chance that the plan will be approved by team members. 4. Team members get a random attribute boost. When passing through customs, the bonus remains unchanged. Adventurers notice that their stats have increased. Shanghai glanced at his status window and noticed that his perception had increased slightly, and realized that the team leader was able to raise the stats of his teammates. The man with glasses turned to the leader, saying that he had a question. He said that the only way they knew of to summon witches was by using the harmonica, and that they were hiding in the lake, and they couldn't complete the task without them. The leader of the security team, picking up a stone from the ground, says that this is not a problem. The bespectacled man asks him for more details, and the latter, tossing a rock in his hand, says with a smile that his title allows him to annoy the designated target, and explains that the provocateur loses 2 points of intelligence, becomes vindictive and fearless in the face of death. The yellow title provocateur is visible above his head. Description of the effect of the title provocateur. 1. Intelligence -2, stamina +3. 2. This gives you a 20% chance to build a dialogue and a 50% chance to make target. 3. Angry. When used, 2 intelligence points are deducted. The fat guy is surprised to note that he is also an adventurer. The provocateur says that to establish a forced dialogue, you just need to attract the attention of the opponent, and with a smile throws a stone into the lake. The witch peeked out of the water. The leader of the security squad shouts insults at her and shows her 2 middle fingers. The dialogue box says that the second provocateur effect is used. A red dialogue box announces success, and the witch rises from the water, her face contorted with anger. She rushes in his direction, and he smiles, glad that the provocation has worked. Liang jumps in front of him and tells him to leave the rest to him. Liang approaches the witch, raising his fist to strike at the witch hanging in the air. The leader yells at the others to spread out and let Liang hold her back, and tells them to put on earplugs and spread out around the perimeter. The witch screamed and passed through Liang without taking any damage. The others gritted their teeth in surprise as they noticed what had happened. The witch approached the leader of the guard squad and began to inhale hard. Smiling nervously, he fidgeted. The witch screamed loudly, and the adventurers covered their ears, the force of the sound wave pulling the skin over their faces like a strong wind, and blood gushed out of their noses. Everyone crouched down, except for the leader and the man in the cap and earphones with the long black hair. The witch looked at him questioningly. Getting up from the ground, the fat guy was glad that he was wearing earplugs, and said that his nose was bleeding. Standing up, the leader of the security team asked about the fact that the witch was also a ghost. Liang landed on the ground on 1 foot, and the leader asked if he was sure. Wiping the blood from his nose, he replied that he was sure it would take longer than he thought, and that the monk fist technique they had obtained in the previous dungeon should work, but he wasn't fully used to it yet, so he wouldn't be able to fight at full strength. The leader said that she wasn't that fast, and that he didn't think she could deal much damage to them. He added that he had a hunch that the reward for completing this dungeon would be quite generous. The man in earphones, adjusting his cap, said it was a stupid decision. Cheng Hao turned around and saw a girl walking away from him into the forest and putting on a hood. He asked her why she thought their decision was stupid, and she was surprised, turned around and thought about how she really met a person with 16 perception points, the chance of meeting with which is 1 in 100,000. He saw the title They Pretend I Don't Exist above her head. The dialogue box announced the calculation of 3 title effects. She said, unhappy. Then she vanished into thin air. The dialogue box declared success. The main character looks into space with empty eyes. The fat guy slapped him on the shoulder, asking who he was talking to, and he came to his senses. The guy asked if there was anyone in the direction the main character was looking, and the main character started talking about seeing someone there, wondering if it was a hallucination. Then he sensed something and announced that someone was coming, to which the guy asked, who is coming? Several witches, identical to the one they are fighting, flew out of the forest. Liang slammed a fist that radiated yellow energy into the witch's stomach, sending her flying backwards. The bespectacled man and Hateful Hate were overjoyed. Liang landed behind the witch, who had fallen to the ground on her knees and was holding her stomach. Noticing the witches approaching, he turned back to where the fat guy and Cheng Hai were standing, and shouted to the leader that they were mistaken, and there were more than one witch in this dungeon, and they obviously knew about it in 2 ways. Behind the surprised leader, many witches flew out of the forest. The fat guy opened his mouth in horror. The leader of the security squad chuckled sarcastically, asking if it was too much. The leader stiffened. Cheng Hai clenched his teeth tensely and thought that earplugs would be useless against so many. Liang asked why everyone was frozen and shouted for them to run. The adventurers ran as fast as they could, splitting up in the forest. Hateful Hate runs, waving his arms, one of which is tied with a red thread tied in a bow, and in horror asks why this always happens to him. He remembers lying on the floor with his hand outstretched to a man sitting on the couch with 2 girls with red threads on their shoulders, lying with empty eyes and expressions, a man with a gold necklace around his neck, who, smiling broadly, tells him that he thought he should let go. Sticking out his tongue mockingly, he asked who said he enjoyed watching others live their lives in regret, pain, and suffering. This isn't a rank criminal, Gao Cheng Yun, a level 7 adventurer. Hateful Hate turns in horror at the witch approaching him and in a rage shouts that he has not yet avenged his comrades by swinging his sword. There was an explosion in the forest, throwing up broken trees. Hateful Hate is lying on the ground, a pool of blood under his head. He thinks about how he can die here. A fat guy surrounded by witches brandishes a sword and shouts about whether they know who he is and says that he is a man who wants to become a legendary adventurer and shouts at them to get lost. The witches hiss back. The bespectacled man was leaning over the ground in tears, looking at the approaching hissing witches, and saying, addressing himself as a mother, that he was wrong and should not have cheated the depositors. Liang is standing in a fighting stance, blood streaming from his eyes, and they are shouting at the witches to attack and that he is not afraid of them. Behind him, the leader is sitting on the ground with his back against a rock. His eyes and ears are bleeding, and he tells himself to pull himself together. He reflects that it's no wonder the vendor and Liao didn't put a level limit on entering the dungeon, and that they are deliberately luring level 4-5 adventurers here to take all the resources after they die. With a look of annoyance on his face, the leader says what a good plan this is. Cheng Hao approaches him and asks if he has any ideas on how they can kill these witches. The leader turned to look at him in surprise, his bloodied eyes still closed. Cheng Hao told him to hurry up if he had a plan. Then he said that they had other ways of attacking besides the voice, and that even though their strength wasn't that great, they could still deal a lot of damage. He added that even if he sacrificed his hearing, he wasn't sure he could get out of the dungeon without being chased by them. Hearing his voice, the leader asked him if he was a writer from Dongshan, to which the latter replied in the affirmative. The leader replied that he did not expect that he, a novice, would be better than him, and asked how he understood him if he had hearing problems. The main character replied that his perception is equal to 16, and he can read lips. The leader replied that in his opinion, there was no way out, and that these witches were immune to physical attacks, and their resistance to fire, lightning, and strong acids was also surprisingly high, and added that frankly speaking, it wasn't something that a team of adventurers like them could handle. The main character clarified with him that it turns out that he can't do anything. Gritting his teeth and not speaking for long, the leader replied that he could. He explained that in the last dungeon, Liang received a small jar of sacred oil blessed by the monks. Liang screams as he is attacked by the smiling witches, blood pouring from his mouth, ears, and eyes. The leader added that his monk's fist could injure a witch, and the sword bound with sacred oil could also deal damage to them, and said that it was only damage, and that he didn't think a novice adventurer would be able to survive a siege by so many ghosts. Stepping forward, to the leader's surprise, Cheng Hai said that they couldn't just sit idly by. The witches looked at the approaching protagonist in surprise and shouted at him. The dialogue box announced that he was on the verge of death and activated the second effect, Strength +4, Dexterity +4. Above the main character, who was shrouded in dark purple energy, the title Escape Death appeared. The dialogue box reported that the title holder was in the correct physical state, Strength +4, Agility +4, Perception +4. He sat down on the ground behind the Liang and picked it up, holding it under his arm. Cheng Hai asked him if he could hear him, and said that he had asked his companion, who had told him that to pass the dungeon, he had to give him oil. He asked if he agreed. Gritting his teeth against the pain, Liang asked again, pass the level. Then he replied that he seemed to be blind and was afraid that he couldn't control the adventurer's panel to get him what he needed. The main character looked at the ground in frustration. Liang then raised a fist glowing with yellow energy and said that he had another way to mine it for him. He slapped his chest and blood spurted out of his mouth. Shocked, Cheng Hai asked what he was doing. As Liang was dying, he thought that it was possible to get the oil after his death. Looking at Liang's body, the protagonist thought that he had a feeling that Liang had made a mistake and that the oil wasn't worth a person's death. Beside Liang's corpse lay glass, iron, and oil blessed by the monks. He noted that as a result of the effects of his titles, he gained 20 dexterity points, which would be enough for him to escape even though the chances of survival are not great. Cheng Hai holds a yellow bottle of oil in his hand. The dialogue box announces the receipt of an unknown magic item, oil blessed by monks. He poured oil on his sword as the witches swirled around him. He looked at them and said he wouldn't hold back because they were getting on his nerves. The witches got angry and threw an attack on the main character. Cheng Hai stood with his sword in both hands while the witches slashed at him with their claws. The dialogue box announced that the sword blessing was open. The following dialogue box explained that this is a magical sacred technique that adds +2 damage to evil creatures. While preparing to attack, Cheng Hai repeated, +2 damage. Swinging his sword, his eyes lit up red, and he said, then let's get started. The salesman and Liao are standing in front of the entrance to a dungeon in an abandoned construction site. They notice a glow from the portal where the girl with the title comes out. They pretend that I don't exist, and the seller notes that someone still managed to get out, but he doesn't see the person who came out of the portal. Liao, yawning, asks who is there and if he was mistaken. He replies that he is serious. She thinks that they really do use unsuitable dungeons as traps to lure adventurers there, leave them to die, then collect drops from them, and sometimes even kill the survivors with their own hands. As she stares at her phone, she thinks she knows why they're doing this. Her phone screen shows a chat with her employer. She writes that after an investigation, it turned out that there are problems with the dungeon in which the employer's son died. In the next message, she explained that the adventurer who sells the place to his son is a scavenger vulture, a person who uses high-difficulty dungeons to kill adventurers for their resources. The employer replied that he knew, and said that the reward would later go to the girl's account. Cheng Hai cuts the witch in half with a sword strike. The witch disappears into thin air with a cry. Tired, Cheng Hai falls to the ground and tries to catch his breath. He thinks it was close, and if there were just a few more of them, even a recovery potion wouldn't help him. He turned his attention to the adventurer's panel, where a notice appeared stating that the death dance he performed with the banshee was so beautiful that the passing ruler of death liked it, and he received the gift Undead Can't Kill Me, which will save him from dying at the hands of non-life, and yellow a hint that suggests closing a dungeon, with a friendly reminder that shared dungeons are more important than individual ones. Upon discovering his newfound bonus of being immune to death at the hands of the undead, the main character perked up with joy. Deciding that the extra reward is so great that the main rewards and resources pale in front of it, he agrees to close the dungeon. A blue dialog box indicates that the calculation is in progress. The calculation is complete, and the yellow dialog box says, "You, an adventurer of the Z level. We have taken a step towards becoming a legend. New title received, Lone Wolf. Gets a new title, Wolf in Sheep's Clothing. Received a new title, Spirit Killer. Exclusive hidden skills obtained, Dance with Death in 1 step, 1 kill. Equipment scroll received. Equipment converter 1 received. Received a rare object Song of the Sea, a box containing the voice of a banshee. Friendly reminder, you can put unused equipment in the furnace to get higher level equipment." As Cheng Hai rejoices at the rewards for closing the dungeon, he thinks about the fact that in addition to a rare item and new titles, he has received 2 new skills, noting that this dungeon is not so difficult for nothing. The leader asked why it was so quiet and if the Dongshan writer was still alive. The main character caught himself saying that he almost forgot about it. Running up to the leader, he asked him how he was feeling and if he could stand up. Gritting his teeth, he replied that it was hard for him and that it looked like the witch's scream had reached his internal organs. Cheng Hai looked at him with a serious but calm gaze and said, "That's how it is." He asked if everyone else was dead. The main character, remembering the dead bodies of adventurers, replied with a sigh that the fat man, the bespectacled man, that man and his comrade are dead. The leader noted that Cheng Hai didn't seem to be in the dungeon for the first time, and suggested that his level was very high, as were his stats. Touching a finger to his cheek, he replied that he thought the leader would be the one to sort things out. He replied that he was left all alone and asked not to talk about it. He offered to cooperate and said that he would keep his secret, explaining that in exchange for his rewards, he would do the same for him, and asked how he would feel about it. He added that if he does not trust him, he can take the contract as a safety net. Next to the leader of the security team lying on the ground is a bundle of paper signed like a bureau contract. Cheng Hai pointed the sword at the leader and said that the dead leader would also keep his secret perfectly, and then he could keep the contract for himself. The leader replied that he wouldn't be able to get the most out of this dungeon that way, and that the contract was directly related to the mission of this dungeon, asking if he didn't understand that. The main character looked at the leader in silence, without removing his sword. The leader said that the vendor and Liao were probably waiting for the survivors at the entrance of the dungeon, and that they were much stronger than he thought. He added that he could divert their attention so that he could fight back or escape, and that letting him out of here alive was the best option for Cheng Hai. The entrance to a dungeon in an abandoned construction site lit up, and when Liao noticed this, he noticed that someone was coming after all. The salesman, flexing his fists, said that last time he probably really imagined it. Cheng Hai came out of the portal, helping the leader walk. The salesman noticed that the dungeon was collapsing and asked in surprise that they had cleared it out. Behind the leader, a sword appeared in the protagonist's hand, and Liao shouted at the vendor to watch out for it. Cheng Hai, with a serious face and red eyes, charged and pierced the chest of the salesman, causing blood to gush out of his mouth. Glancing nervously at the protagonist, Liao said, "Lone Wolf." With his face covered in the vendor's blood and his eyes glowing red, Cheng Hai turned to him and said that the weaker one should be removed first. The dialogue box says, "Dance with Death. During danger, the damage dealt is tripled." The next dialogue box says, 1 step, 1 kill, on the edge of life and death, your perception increases to 18, and you can predict your opponent's next move.